So back in the early to mid 1990s, there was a huge boom in 2D platformers, particularly on the sort of Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. And most of these kind of games were your cutesy, character-based platformers, stuff like Sonic and Mario, of course, and then you had Bubsy, Cool Spot, and a whole load of other really simplistic platformers.
But then another game took a bold step and decided to create a more challenging and puzzle-based platform game that would appeal more to a mature audience. With a considerably less whimsical plot than your standard platformer fare and some interesting graphical innovations, this game would go on to become and remain the best-selling French game of all time. That game is, of course, Flashback. Released in 1992 by Delphine Software on various home computers and consoles, including my personal favourite of the bunch, the Atari Jaguar, as a sequel of sorts to Another World. It wasn't in the same story, but it followed up in a very similar manner with very similar graphical techniques and very similar gameplay, which in turn borrowed quite a lot from 1990's Prince of Persia. And it turned out to be a pretty big hit. Flashback is a very progressive game in many respects. It's got a really big unfolding narrative that has astounding depth by contemporary standards, but it isn't completely clear of cliché. The story starts with our protagonist Conrad waking up, say it with me now, with amnesia. But honestly, the game makes it work really well. You as a player are left to try and figure out Conrad's backstory just as much as Conrad is, effectively making him an empty vessel for the player to interact with and grow into the game a lot more with. But as many of today's AAA games are beginning to understand, story can mean nothing without great gameplay, and of course Flashback delivers here too. I think the best way I can probably describe it is it's kind of like a mix between a 2D Tomb Raider and the aforementioned Prince of Persia, complete with slightly cumbersome controls, however, particularly in reference to Tomb Raider there. I don't know if it's the same for the other versions of the game, but with the Mega Drive, of course, there's only a 3-button option, meaning that up is jump and start access is in the inventory screen. It might take a couple of minutes getting used to it, but it's fairly intuitive after that and easy to come back to. A can be held to run when using the D-pad, B is action, and C pulls out, puts away the gun. Yes, it sounds simple, but then things get a little complicated when you try doing other stuff, like holding a ledge, or jumping in a specific way, or running, and sometimes I have noticed that the controls mess up a little bit, and on more than one occasion that has caused me to die. It's nothing too bad, but it's something that's worth noting anyway. The majority of gameplay consists of solving various puzzles, often item or object based, to progress through the level. Again, I'll point out that it's a bit like a precursor to Tomb Raider, but of course remains entertaining, especially seeing that Tomb Raider is, one of my favourite games of all time after all. And just like Tomb Raider, yes, and I'm very sorry that there is going to be a lot of comparisons to Core's game, Flashback certainly presents an excellent challenge and does have some truly brain-bending moments in its game as you try to overcome whichever puzzle's been thrown your way in order to progress. And of course, just to add to the great gameplay is some of the best graphics in terms of 2D that I have ever seen on the Mega Drive. Flashback has some gorgeously detailed backgrounds, but the real charm is in the fantastic character models. They aren't particularly 2D beauties, in fact at base value they're pretty basic, but in motion it's a completely different story. Characters have been animated using an independently developed form of rotoscoping that adds water-like fluidity to Conrad and certain other human characters, or human-like characters within the game. It's really a minor detail in the grand scheme of it, but it's always up near the front of my mind when I boot the game up and get playing again. I have got to admit here that one of my favourite things is to press C to pull out my gun, then make Conrad crouch and roll forward. It sounds a bit pathetic, I know, but it's a great thing to see, and in my opinion puts even some modern games to shame. Flashback offers reasonable challenge to side with its good-looking graphics. It's not punishingly hard, nor is it a walk in the park. And it isn't just gamer hard. As I've mentioned, the puzzles sort of tend to push the old grey matter as well, and this is where the larger part of the difficulty comes from. However, that's not to say that the game isn't completely difficult in the gamer's perspective. Conrad does have a shield, which acts as a form of health bar, which can take up to 4 hits before it's depleted. After that, if you're hit, it's game over. It's not too bad to play because the enemy count in Flashback isn't exactly high, but sometimes it does turn out that you will just take enough hits in a certain situation. It might be 1 or 2 hits in an encounter, and it is very, very possible to die through combat. The game does also have an inclusion of instant deaths. It's something that's a bit of a touchy subject for many, I know, in terms of gaming, is instant deaths, but they are included as a bit of a hurdle. If you, for example, step on a poison gas outlet that's on the floor, or if you step on electricity, then you will have an instant game over. Thankfully, however, this is for the most part done fairly well, although there have been times when I've been forced to backtrack through death, rushing something because I've done it multiple times, forgotten that there's a certain part that I have to avoid, jumped, and been electrocuted. Added to that, of course, is the fact that Conrad, if he falls too far, will also die. What I'm trying to make quite clear is that the shield isn't cushy, it's not your saving grace all the time, it's mostly for the combat. There are ways to die, and I think I quite like the fact that it places its emphasis on there being danger and difficulty, but not just in terms of big enemies will kill you, although of course that is true, but the enemy's never too hard, although there is a decent enough variety. And when you add all this together, the game certainly has remained loved and remembered. As an iOS and Android remaster release in 2013 shows there is certainly still an interest and an audience for this game. It was really quite the game changer, and its cinematic nature was ahead of the curve, a trendsetter for the often story-driven offerings of modern AAA gaming. In a more contemporary setting, the game received a sequel in 1995 for the then newly released Sony PlayStation called Fade to Black, but seeing as I hadn't heard of this until very recently and a step to the third dimension, I'm going to assume that it didn't do very great, although admittedly, upon research, there seems to be something lost in translation from the move from gorgeous fluid 2D to the clunky polygons of early 3D gaming. It sold well enough in Europe and managed to get itself to be a platinum seller, which means of course it sold over 1 million units, but it's not a title that's spoken of very much on the internet nowadays and in various magazines. It tends to have mostly been dropped from PlayStation. As I say, I hadn't heard of it until fairly recently. Overall then, of course, Flashback is a game that I thoroughly recommend, if you couldn't already guess. Sure, there's another game as a follow-up, but Flashback is the one that managed to get it the most right, especially when you look at Another World, which is kind of like the Wolfenstein 3D of this series, and of course Flashback being the equivalent to Doom in that rather strange gaming metaphor. As mentioned, there are loads of ports, but honestly the Mega Drive version is most likely the best version to go for. Mine was £8 in a retail store, boxed with manual, compared to the 80 quid you'd probably have to fork out for a brand new Jaguar copy. Flashback on Mega Drive gets a final rating thus and therefore of must have. If you have any of the systems this game isn't expensive on, you should definitely get it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next Retro Rip review video. Take it easy. Bye bye.